April 1945. The war in Europe was ending, but for thousands of German women standing behind barbed wire in the American prisoner camps, a different kind of reckoning was about to begin. The thunder of artillery had faded, but the scent of smoke, metal, and fear still hung in the air. They had served in communication units, supply lines, and auxiliary corps, wearing the uniform of a nation that promised them glory and delivered ruin. Now, stripped of rank, stripped of command, they faced an order they did not understand: to shower, to wash. For women who had grown up under the Reich, that single word carried a memory far darker than dirt. The word shower did not mean cleanliness anymore. It meant death. The very command that had sent millions into gas chambers was now being spoken by men in American uniforms. Yet there was no screaming, no barking dogs, no gun barrels waiting, only quiet authority and a stack of folded towels that smelled faintly of soap. American soap, ivory-colored, smooth, with a strange creamy scent that felt foreign to their senses, dulled by war. The guards gestured toward the bathhouse. Hesitant steps followed. The women entered, uncertain whether to obey or resist, the tension in their bodies as sharp as the wire outside. When the water began to flow, the sound was wrong. It was gentle, real water, cascading from steel pipes, clean and warm. Gasps echoed through the chamber, as if the water itself had struck them. There was no burning, no smoke, no death, just the sensation of heat against cold skin, the first touch of comfort since captivity began. The soap lathered easily, slick and soft, releasing a scent that none of them could place. Coconut, maybe vanilla. For a moment they were no longer prisoners or soldiers or servants of a lost empire. They were simply women remembering what it felt like to be human. Some cried without sound. Others washed their faces over and over as if trying to erase the months of mud, fear, and guilt that clung to them like another uniform. But the moment of relief was tangled with confusion. Why would the enemy treat them with such gentleness? The propaganda had promised something else. They were told the Americans were monsters, brutal conquerors who would humiliate them. Yet here they were, given soap, water, and silence. No shouting, no blows. Only the faint sound of dripping water and the low hum of foreign voices outside. The Americans had their reasons. This was not mercy for mercy's sake. It was method. The United States Army had learned something about control that went beyond weapons and rations. Cleanliness itself could be power. The camps were organized with precision. Every detail from the meal schedule to the medical inspections had purpose. To the soldiers guarding the gates, this was order. To the intelligence officers who oversaw the camps, it was an experiment. How quickly could the defeated begin to accept comfort from their conquerors? How fast could discipline replace defiance? The soap that now coated the skin of captured German women was as much a tool of reconditioning as it was of hygiene. It cleaned more than dirt. It stripped away ideology. It was designed to make surrender feel safe. Among those women was Hilda Weiss, 22 years old, once a communications aide stationed near Cologne. She had carried coded messages for the Luftwaffe during the final collapse, her voice crackling through broken lines as she relayed orders that no longer mattered. When the Americans captured her convoy near Remagen, her uniform was torn, her hair matted, her body streaked with grime. She had not bathed in nearly 3 weeks. Inside that shower room, surrounded by women just as broken, she hesitated to touch the soap. When she finally did, the scent hit her like a memory she could not name. Clean, rich, unfamiliar. She later described the moment in an interview years after the war. It felt like being forgiven, though no one said a word. But forgiveness had nothing to do with it. The Americans were not saints, they were strategists. They knew that order could do what fear could not. Comfort could conquer quietly. Outside the barracks, Sergeant James Howard watched the line of women exit, their hair still damp under the pale sun. He was 24, a farm boy from Iowa who had never been this close to an enemy. He expected defiance, anger, hatred. What he saw instead was exhaustion. Faces pale, eyes hollow, bodies shivering not from cold, but from something like disbelief. He wrote to his sister that night describing the scene. Some looked afraid of the soap as if it were poison. Others smiled through tears when the water turned warm. He could not explain it, but in that moment the war felt smaller than the sound of running water. The letter never reached home. It was censored for its tone. The military preferred stories of victory, not of pity. But the truth lingered among the guards. The enemy was beginning to look like them. By the end of May, the camps across Western Germany held more than 2 million prisoners, among them nearly 50,000 women. The American facilities, compared to the Soviet ones in the East, seemed almost humane. Rations were measured, medical checks routine, and sanitation enforced with military discipline. Yet beneath this efficiency lay something deeper. The United States was already thinking about the next war, the war for memory. Every prisoner released would become a messenger to the ruins of Germany. Each would carry an image of their captors home. The Americans wanted that image to be clean, structured, fair. They wanted their former enemies to remember the smell of soap, not the sting of hunger. A bar of soap could change how a nation thought, and slowly it did. When the women were finally released months later, many spoke not of cruelty, but of confusion. They told stories of guards who smiled, of food that tasted strange but plentiful, of showers that did not kill but cleansed. The word shower had begun to change meaning again, from terror to routine, from death to renewal. For women like Hilda, that transformation was the beginning of a long internal war, to reconcile what she had believed with what she had seen, to understand how mercy could come from the side that destroyed her world. Years later, historians would find her words in a faded notebook kept by an interviewer. The sentence stood alone on the last page. The soap smelled like the future. Summer came early to the Rhineland that year, though no one called it summer. The air was heavy with the dust of collapse. Roads were lined with columns of displaced families, soldiers without armies, children without parents. Yet, behind the fences of the American prisoner camps, something unexpected was happening. Life was reorganizing itself. Gardens appeared in the corners of compounds. Women mended uniforms that no longer represented a nation. The faint smell of American soap still lingered in the barracks, clinging to the wooden planks like a ghost of another world. For many of the prisoners, that scent had become part of the memory of defeat, inseparable from the faces of the guards who handed it out each week with military precision. To the Americans, it was a supply item. To the women who received it, it was proof that they had survived. The soap came in crates marked Quartermaster Corps. Each bar weighed exactly 4 ounces, packed in paper that turned translucent when wet. It was made in factories across the Midwest and shipped with the same urgency as ammunition months earlier. The ingredients were listed on the side in English words few of the prisoners could read: sodium tauloate, coconut oil, perfume. It was a chemical summary of American abundance, an invisible statement of power. The women who scrubbed their hands with it felt a strange pride in being clean again, but also guilt. Some whispered that cleanliness was a luxury for the victors, not the conquered. Others said it was a kind of surrender, but day after day they used it, unable to resist the human need to feel whole again. One afternoon in June, Hilda Weiss stood by the laundry line near the edge of the compound, watching the American soldiers play baseball beyond the wire. The sound of laughter carried across the field. She had not heard laughter like that since before the war. It was a reminder that life had continued elsewhere while her own world ended. A guard named Howard tossed her an apple once, a gesture that startled her more than the gunfire ever had. She bit into it, and the taste of sweetness made her cry. In that small moment, she understood what her country had lost. Not just the war, but the simplicity of being human without fear. Later that night, lying on the wooden bunk, she pressed the bar of soap against her nose and tried to remember the last time she had smelled something that did not remind her of smoke. The Americans documented everything. Every ration distributed, every medical inspection recorded, every shower scheduled. To them, the camps were proof of civilization. They believed that order was victory. They were not wrong. Reports sent to Washington described remarkable behavioral shifts among prisoners within weeks of capture. The discipline and defiance that had once defined the German Auxiliary Corps dissolved into quiet compliance. The army psychologists called it reintegration through routine. They noted that the prisoners began to mimic American habits, folding clothes in neat piles, standing straighter, even attempting to learn English words. The most common among them was soap. To the military command, the camps became a model for what post-war Germany could become, not rebuilt through ideology, but through imitation. The Americans wanted to show that structure and comfort, when combined, could erase years of indoctrination. They were right. Letters intercepted from released prisoners told a consistent story. The Americans were firm but fair. They were clean. They were calm. They were not what the Reich had promised. A German officer's wife wrote that the first thing her husband asked for upon returning home was American soap, not bread, not cigarettes, soap. It had become a symbol of stability in a world that had forgotten the meaning of it. But beneath this quiet transformation lay another truth. The Americans were not immune to their own contradictions. In the same months that German prisoners were being washed, fed, and photographed for reports, displaced persons from Eastern Europe wandered through the ruins, starving. The soap that comforted the defeated was the same luxury denied to the liberated. In that paradox, the line between mercy and power blurred. For Sergeant Howard and others who guarded the camp, the daily routine began to feel hollow. He wrote in his journal that sometimes he could not tell which side had truly won. The women looked less like prisoners and more like ghosts being taught how to live again. He wondered what would happen when they were free, when the fences came down and they returned to a country that no longer existed. The answer came quietly that autumn. Release orders began to arrive. Prisoners were processed, names checked, papers signed. Many of the women carried their issued soap with them, wrapped carefully in cloth as if it were a relic. Hilda did the same. She walked through the gate with her eyes down, the sound of boots and gravel beneath her feet. The world beyond the camp was grey, silent, and waiting. The ruins of towns stood like bones against the sky. She passed a group of children playing with sticks, their faces streaked with dirt. She thought of giving them her soap, but held it close instead. It was the only clean thing she owned. In the years that followed, historians would trace the quiet influence of those camps, not through official policies or political documents, but through memory. The stories told by the women who had been there shaped how West Germany would later view the American occupation. The kindness they described was not always accurate, not always complete, but it was powerful. It created a narrative of moral superiority that outlasted the soldiers and the fences. The soap became a metaphor, a simple object that carried the weight of empire and redemption. When asked decades later what she remembered most from captivity, Hilda did not mention fear or humiliation. She said it was the moment the water turned warm. That warmth had changed something fundamental. The Americans had proven a lesson older than warfare itself. Power was not only measured in bullets or bombs, but in control over comfort. The ability to decide who could feel clean, who could feel safe, who could feel human. In the barracks of the defeated, beneath the steam and scent of soap, a new kind of conquest was taking shape. One that would not end with the signing of peace treaties, but would continue in the minds of those who survived it. Winter arrived early in 1946, sharp and unforgiving. The landscape of the defeated nation looked like a frozen wound. Bombed cities lay quiet under thin snow, their skeletal buildings jutting into the gray sky. Across the Rhine, the American prisoner camps had changed purpose. Many of the barracks once filled with captured soldiers and auxiliaries now housed displaced civilians or refugees returning from the east. Yet, traces of the past lingered everywhere, especially in the faint smell of the American soap that had soaked into the wooden walls. It was a scent that refused to disappear, even after the prisoners were gone. For those who had once lived inside those fences, the memory of that fragrance remained as strong as the sound of sirens during the war. In Cologne, Hilda Weiss found herself working in a small post office that survived the bombings. Her hands, once used to type coded military messages, now sorted letters between rubble and silence. The rebuilding was slow, uncertain, filled with the ghosts of former loyalties. The new authorities spoke of democracy and reconstruction, of a Germany that would never rise as before. But the past was not easily erased. Neighbors whispered, files vanished, names were changed. People learned to forget out loud while remembering in private. Yet amid the moral debris of defeat, small details from captivity began to take on symbolic power. The American soap, the showers, the order of the camps, all became part of a quiet mythology. A generation of Germans, especially women, carried those images as proof that even in surrender, dignity could survive. The Americans had planned it that way. Reports compiled by army psychologists during 1946 and 1947 revealed the deliberate strategy behind the treatment of German prisoners. It was called controlled reconstruction. The idea was simple: to rebuild a nation, start by rebuilding its habits. Cleanliness, punctuality, obedience to order without fear. These were not luxuries, they were lessons. The soldiers guarding those camps were unknowingly teaching discipline through routine, hygiene through repetition, morality through comfort. The soap was not chosen by accident. Its scent, soft and industrial, was designed to linger, to associate the feeling of safety with American efficiency. It was not just about removing dirt. It was about replacing an entire mental landscape. For Hilda, these ideas were invisible at the time. She only knew that life after the camp felt strange in its quietness. She no longer saluted anyone. She no longer expected orders shouted in her ear. She simply woke, worked, ate, and tried to sleep. But something about that camp experience had left a mark deeper than memory. Whenever she washed her hands, she searched for that same scent, the one that had defined the first day of her captivity. She bought every bar of soap she could find in the ruined markets, but none were the same. The German soaps of those years were harsh, grey, often made from whatever fats could be rendered from the scraps of a starving economy. The American soap was gone, but the feeling it carried remained, haunting her senses. She once told a friend that it reminded her of warmth she could never earn again. Meanwhile, in the United States, soldiers like James Howard had returned home with their own ghosts. For many of them, the war's aftermath was stranger than combat. The letters they wrote, the reports they filed, described not hatred but confusion. They had seen the enemy as victims, and that blurred the sharp moral lines drawn by victory. Howard, now back on his family farm, often found himself thinking about the faces of the women behind the wire. He could not reconcile the idea of mercy with the scale of destruction his side had unleashed. He kept a bar of that same army soap in a drawer, its paper yellowing, the scent fading with time. To him it symbolized everything the war had become, a mixture of power, guilt, and the faint perfume of something too clean to be real. Historians who later examined the post-war years came to see the camps as more than holding grounds. They were laboratories of ideology, testing how the defeated could be reshaped through exposure to comfort. The evidence was subtle but undeniable. Prisoners released from American custody tended to express more trust in Western institutions than those held in Soviet or French zones. They adapted faster, voted differently, and often spoke of the Americans with reluctant respect. It was not the result of propaganda leaflets or speeches. It was the result of direct experience, of water running warm instead of cold, of soap that did not sting the skin, of being treated, for the first time in years, as something more than expendable. By 1948, as Germany divided between East and West, the memory of those days became a quiet foundation for a new identity. The women who had once been prisoners became mothers, teachers, secretaries, fragments of a nation learning to exist without flags. Many of them, like Hilda, never spoke openly about the war. Yet in their silence was a strange loyalty, not to the lost Reich, but to the idea that decency could survive even in defeat. They had seen the face of power up close, and it had not shouted. It had handed them soap and turned on the water. In later interviews conducted by post-war researchers, recurring details appeared in their testimonies. The texture of the soap, the exact temperature of the water, the shock of being treated without contempt. These were the memories that outlasted the trauma, the moments that reshaped their understanding of humanity itself. The showers became a symbol of contradiction, a ritual of cleansing that carried both humiliation and healing. They entered the chambers expecting death and left believing in the possibility of forgiveness. Not divine forgiveness, but something human, quiet, and practical. The paradox of it all fascinated scholars for decades. How could such a small act, a shower with soap, alter the moral landscape of millions? How could cleanliness become an instrument of conquest? The answer, as many concluded, lay in the psychology of surrender. The defeated must learn not only to obey, but to admire the victor. The Americans understood this instinctively. The cleanliness, the efficiency, the order were not just reflections of culture. They were the tools of empire. Through soap and structure, they had achieved what weapons could not. They had made their enemies desire the world that had conquered them. In her old age, Hilda would still remember that day in April when the water first touched her skin. She would describe it to her granddaughter not as a moment of humiliation, but as the first time she believed the war was truly over. The scent of that soap, she said, was the smell of surrender and also of survival. She kept one fragment of the original bar, wrapped in cloth, stored in a tin box under her bed. When she died in 1982, the box was found unopened. Inside, the soap had long since lost its scent, but the paper still carried faint traces of the word stamped into its surface: United States Army. By the early 1950s, the ruins of the Reich had turned into scaffolds and construction sites. Cities that once echoed with sirens now buzzed with the noise of rebuilding. Concrete replaced ashes, and new walls rose where the old ones had fallen. But beneath the visible recovery, the invisible war continued. It was fought in the minds of those who remembered. For the German women who had passed through the American camps, memory had become both a refuge and a burden. They carried it like a hidden scar, a private testament to a time when their world collapsed, and yet something inside them was quietly rebuilt. Hilda Weiss was one of them. She lived in a small apartment above a bakery in Bonn, working as a typist for a local newspaper that wrote about the nation's slow recovery. Each morning she walked past children playing in the rubble that was still being cleared, their laughter echoing off the broken walls. Sometimes she thought about writing her story, about the camp, about the showers, about the strange comfort that came from the enemy's soap, but she never did. To speak of it felt disloyal, not to the Reich, but to the pain itself. The memory was too delicate, too complex to be reduced to words. So she remained silent and watched her country learn how to live again. Across Germany, the influence of the American occupation was becoming visible in every aspect of life. New schools, new music, new products. The scent of imported goods began to drift through the markets of West Germany. Coffee, chocolate, soap, especially soap. The same bars once rationed in the camps were now sold in stores, wrapped in colorful paper that promised purity and comfort. It was no longer just an object of survival. It had become a cultural emblem. Cleanliness was modernity. Cleanliness was Western. The simple act of washing had turned into a silent pledge of belonging to a new world that valued civility over ideology. Sociologists studying the post-war generation would later call this the moral reconstruction of Europe. They argued that defeat had done what propaganda never could. It had replaced arrogance with reflection. It had forced people to measure value not by power, but by the ordinary acts that made life human. For the women who once feared the sound of the word shower, this transformation was deeply personal. The trauma did not vanish, but it changed shape. Every time they stepped under running water, they remembered the day when they first felt warmth instead of terror. The Americans had not intended to give them faith, but they had given them contrast. And in that contrast, a new kind of belief was born. By 1960, the Federal Republic of Germany stood as one of the fastest-growing economies in the world. American aid, policy, and influence had done what occupation alone could not. It had reshaped culture. Yet the memory of war still hovered in the corners of every home. In Hilda's apartment, the tin box still rested under her bed. The bar of army soap had turned yellow and dry, its scent gone, its edges brittle. But every time she opened the box, even briefly, she felt something stir. Not nostalgia, not pride, but a quiet recognition of survival. The object that once symbolized surrender had become her proof of endurance. It reminded her that even the smallest kindness could outlast empires. In universities across Europe, new generations of scholars began to analyze the moral legacy of the Second World War. They debated the meaning of justice, the psychology of obedience, and the fragile line between guilt and redemption. The testimonies of women like Hilda were studied not for their pain, but for what they revealed about transformation. Many concluded that the process of captivity, while humiliating, also forced self-confrontation. Stripped of ideology, faced with ordinary humanity, they had learned to see power differently. The soap was no longer just soap. It was the moment when force revealed its other face, when dominance chose to civilize instead of destroy, when victory expressed itself not through vengeance, but through control disguised as compassion. The American command had perhaps never intended such depth. To them, it had been a practical matter, an organized way to prevent disease, to maintain discipline, to standardize the handling of millions of captives. Yet what emerged from those barracks was something far greater than any report could measure, a cultural transaction that would ripple through decades. The defeated adopted the habits of their conquerors. The conquerors, in turn, learned that mercy could reinforce power more effectively than punishment. It was an unspoken lesson, one that would shape global policy long after the last camp closed. For Hilda, life moved quietly toward its close. She married, raised 2 sons, and watched her country divide itself along political lines that echoed old fears in new forms. But the past remained with her, gentle and persistent. Every spring, when the air turned soft and the rain returned, she would step outside and breathe deeply, the scent of wet stone and soap from nearby houses reminding her of a morning in captivity that had rewritten her understanding of the world. She never spoke of it, but her children sensed that the war had left in her not bitterness, but restraint, a belief that power should always be measured in gentleness. When she died, her eldest son found her papers and the tin box beneath her bed. The soap was still there, fragile and colorless. He did not understand why his mother had kept it until he read the small note she had tucked inside. It said, "The water was warm." That was all. 4 words that carried the weight of everything she could never explain. In the years that followed, historians would write about the war in terms of battles, treaties, and reconstruction. But the true transformation of Europe was written in smaller, quieter acts. The kindness that did not fit the logic of revenge, the order that followed chaos, the clean water that erased the dirt of ideology. For those who had lived through it, the memory of defeat was not just loss, it was instruction, and so the legacy of that moment lived on, carried by those who survived and passed down to those who would never know the taste of war. They built a continent where the memory of cruelty existed alongside the memory of care, where power was understood not only as destruction, but as the ability to restore. In that delicate balance, history found its resolution. And that wraps up today's story. If you found this journey through the forgotten corners of post-war history meaningful, make sure to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories that uncover the human side of history. Your support helps bring these hidden moments to light. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.